Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are delighted to have you join us for our fourth and final session in a series of programming on the future of open space. Throughout the series, we've discussed how cities are looking to open space to ease some of the pressures of physical distancing during this time of crisis. These panels have covered community-centered planning for the reclamation and activation of streets, design guidelines for distancing, the role of streetscapes in the survival of small businesses, and the critical need for equitable and accessible parks and green spaces. 2020 has underscored the importance of the public realm and its critical role in the livability and recovery of our city. Tonight's program will focus on active transportation. How can the reclamation of open space offer solutions for an improved multimodal transportation system? This conversation will dive deep into this very question. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to the chat where the MAS team has placed some helpful tips and details. I would also like to highlight that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There you can share any questions that you have, and our panelists will take time later in the program to answer them. It is my enormous pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator for this evening, Susan Chin. Susan is an accomplished architect, urbanist, and civic leader, has formed an independent consultancy, Design Connects, and serves on the NYC and Company board and the East Midtown Governing Group. She recently led the Design Trust for Public Space that unlocks the potential of New York City's public spaces and has been doing so since 1995. Prior to the Design Trust, she was the Assistant Commissioner for Capital Projects at New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs, supporting architecture and public art citywide. She also serves on the American Institute of Architects Board and as the AIA-NY chapter president. I am delighted to turn things over to Susan, who will introduce our panelists this evening. Let's get started. Have a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Today's focus is on the future of open space for active transit, or what I'd call mobility, which is essential to our city life. New York City's transportation system much dates back to the 19th and early 20th century, has been one of the best in the world, and at times the most crowded. Yet, with the COVID pandemic, we found we need a more robust and better distributed multimodal transportation network for our city's health, economy, and recovery. We've adapted our open space as resilient infrastructure for New Yorkers to move more safely through the city by alternate modes of transit. More walking, cycling, riding, buses, or even scooters or skateboards. Streets make up more than 26% of our city, yet many neighborhoods with frontline workers and Black and brown New Yorkers still have inadequate access to open streets and safe transit. So going forward, how do we increase access and expand the capacity of our transportation network to make it more seamless and more equitable, like in Vancouver, Copenhagen, or Paris? Most importantly, how do we make our open space, our city's lifeblood, accessible, not just for cars, but for all New Yorkers? I'd like to introduce Sam Schwartz. Sam is the founder and CEO of Sam Schwartz Transportation Consultants. Sam was New York City's traffic commissioner in the 1980s. He started his transportation career in the 1960s as a New York City cabbie, and now leads his own consultancy. So Sam, as a professional with deep experience in the interplay of multiple modes of transit in New York City, what have you learned during COVID and past decades as we plan for New York City's open space, our future city, and active transport?
Well, one of the things that I've learned is people think that this is a seminal moment and we can really change the future and change how we do things and change how we conduct ourselves and how we use public space. But I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes going over about 140 years of history with public space and how we thought at various times that we had certain solutions. And it's worth going forward, if we're going to be talking about the future, to learn from history. So let's take a trip back in time. And if we go back to the 1880s and 1890s, we find that bicycles started to become popular, and we find that the bicycle movement, the American wheelmen were demanding hard road surfaces, and they found themselves with allies in the car industry. And they thought, terrific, with this new automobiles, we'll be able to get hard surfaces. And they were successful, and very quickly the automobile kicked them out. By 1907, 1908, the Bronx River Parkway was built, the first limited access highway, and it said no bikes and no pedestrians. When we look at our history, 1883 to 1909, we built the great 4 East River bridges. Every single one of them had tracks going across them. They were built with pedestrians in mind, with bicycle riders, with mixed use. And soon we forgot that lesson. Not a single big bridge built since 1910 has had transit, and very few have had any kind of decent bicycle or pedestrian access. Look at the Verrazano Bridge, opened in 1963. And then what did we do? We removed the tracks and the pedestrian and bikeways from many of these bridges. By the time I entered city government 50 years ago, there were no longer pedestrian ways on the Manhattan Bridge or on the Queensboro Bridge. And there were terrible passages on the others. And we removed the tracks on the Brooklyn Bridge, which when it had tracks, moved 400,000 people a day. We modernized it, removed the tracks, and replaced it with car lanes, and then it moved 170,000 people a day. So there are various moments from the 1920s to the 1960s when suddenly we destroyed many sidewalks. We destroyed Park Avenue, which looked like a park, in the very center, and we widened roadways for cars and narrowed sidewalks. In 1966, when John Lindsay became mayor, I thought there would be a revolution, and there was, of sorts. He closed Central Park, Prospect Park, created an auto-free zone, or tried to create an auto-free zone called the Red Zone. He started the planning for Times Square to be closed and congestion pricing. And I often think, and we're going to hear from Anna Lewton in a little while, when she talks about how Amsterdam many years ago was car-oriented and how they turned that around. I think in the late 60s, we missed that opportunity, because following John Lindsay, by the 1970s, Abe Beame became mayor. And by then I was working for the city, and I got called into the commissioner's office, who told me Abe Beame's wife, Mary, got caught in a traffic jam on Fifth Avenue, and we had to open Central Park. I thwarted it, but we had to open parts of it, and Central Park remained mostly closed during that time, just during the summer. 1980, Ed Koch with the protected bicycle lanes last only 2 months before he ordered me to remove them, because he was in the back of the president's limousine with the governor, who said to the president, "Look how Ed is pissing away your money." So that was the end of that. We also tried congestion pricing again. We tried it under John Lindsay. We tried it under Ed Koch, and we kept losing. We lost in court under Ed Koch. An act of Congress changed that under John Lindsay, or after John Lindsay left. The last decade has been incredible. There's never been as much change in transportation, at least in my 50-year career, that I've seen in the past decade. And that has to do with the bike share. It has to do with the bicycle lanes that we've seen. It has to do with the app-based transportation. But it has led to worse traffic congestion than we ever saw pre-COVID. And soon traffic is roaring back while transit is not. And we have to remember transit is part of active transportation. We will see traffic congestion by 2021 that is as bad or worse than what we've seen before. So what about the 2020s going forward? We have so many modes of micromobility. Are we gonna see a big growth in micromobility, or are we gonna see a backlash? Are we going to see the micromobility on the sidewalks fighting battles with the pedestrians, or are we going to put them on the roadways? Are we going to succeed on the roadways and having dedicated areas and more areas for transit? What about autonomous vehicles? They're heading our way. Are we going to be caught flat-footed as we were with Uber and Lyft and others? Or are we going to be smart about it and plan for the future? So I hope this is a kickoff for this session, but it's a kickoff for this decade. We have to do smart planning going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. For our audience, I just want to remind you, please post your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again. Now I'd like to introduce Anna Lewton, former bicycle mayor of Amsterdam, the world's first, mobility advisor, and action-driven entrepreneur or entrepreneurs who grew up in the Netherlands with the ambition to become a global leader. She was appointed bicycle mayor of Amsterdam in June 2016 and now resides in New York. Anna, after living in one of the most bike-friendly cities in the world, what can New York City learn from Amsterdam?
Well, Susan, we can learn a lot from each other, actually. It's not only that Amsterdam can learn from, or that New York can learn from Amsterdam, but Amsterdam can learn from New York as well. And what we can learn from Amsterdam first is that everything is possible. We have to remember that Amsterdam wasn't always a bicycle-friendly city. We created it to become more bicycle-friendly, and that's actually possible everywhere around the world. What we can learn is, first of all, what is really important is that the people that are willing to move into this bicycle-friendly culture, that are advocating for it, that's really, really important. And it never stops. The advocating actually never stops. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It gets better because you see progress and you make successes, so it's more fun. But you have to keep on advocating for it. And then at the same time, if you have a forward-thinking policy, that's actually the key to success. So that's what happened in Amsterdam. And please remember that it wasn't like that always. It was actually the people and the politicians that moved it forward. And what is also a good thing to know is that Amsterdam, Dutch people are sort of, they have a culture of acting normal is crazy enough. So we have the right examples. For example, our Prime Minister who rides a bike to work because he doesn't want to ride a car, like a big car, because he doesn't want to show off. And actually riding a bike is more efficient and it's good for your health and it makes him happy. So he is a good example of important people who ride bikes in the Netherlands. So, but what we can learn, what Amsterdam actually can learn from New York is that here, what happened during COVID now with the open streets, that's urban streets plan, that's incredible. I have the luck to live in one of the open streets, and what I've witnessed, people playing here, kids playing at the streets, people sitting on at their steps, you can really like feel what can happen with the city when you close it down for cars. It belongs to the people again, and experiments like that, that's important to do everywhere around the world. And in Amsterdam, we have to keep on doing this as well in order to maintain the culture. And since I'm here now in New York, I moved 4 years ago, I've seen the city's changes. And in 4 years, actually a lot happened. And it doesn't seem like, first of all, but we have to remember as well, it takes step by step. It's not like you can change it like suddenly in one day, it becomes a bicycle culture, a bicycle friendly culture. But you need those little steps in order to create this kind of culture. And I'm actually, the same as Sam just pointed out, I'm really curious, and I'm really wondering how the future of New York will look like in 10, 20, maybe 50 years from now, and what the people will push for. And I want to see all the people coming together, and I want to know, like, what are they willing for? Like, what is it that they want for the city, and how can we create that? And for that we need a bicycle mayor, or maybe an active transit mayor, who can probably help to bring together all these different people and stakeholders. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and hearing all your thoughts and learning from you all. Thank you.
Great, Anna. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Courtney Williams, founder and chief strategist, the Brown Bike Girl, People's Bicycle Mayor of New York City, our first, and as a lifelong community organizer, Courtney launched the Brown Bike Girl in 2016. Hey, about the same time that Anna was elected the bike mayor in the Netherlands. And to knock down the barriers between communities of color and their access and adoption of the life-changing machine known as the bicycle. Courtney, as a planner and lifetime advocate, can you share with us your campaign for bike equity through the Brown Bike Girl and your recent role as the People's Bicycle Mayor of New York City, especially in this time of COVID?
Absolutely. So the Brown Bike Girl is a bicycle advocacy consulting project, which I began after being a individual, more passionate rider who started first organizing for Black women, and really guiding them toward, number one, always education. If you're going to take the leadership role over cycling, you have to believe in education and empowering people in those resources. So that's something that I did then and still do now, and transitioned into, because of my outreach and recruitment, understanding and living the reality that lots of the neighbors of color in New York City are just not fully embraced by or activated by the existing bicycle culture, be they clubs, be they advocacy organizations. And so I decided that I wanted to bridge that gap, or not even just bridge the gap, but be the person who could help those advocacy organizations learn to initiate and do better and more justly by communities of color, and for those communities of color who had the desire to do more bicycling initiatives, learn of the larger bicycling culture. So I did that, started in 2016, really got off the ground in 2017. And then it's just been a lot of, I partnered to educate, and my major prong or thrust or whatever the word is we go with in 2020 is understanding equity and advocacy. The problem is not that people don't want to ride bikes or haven't thought of it. It's that the access, and that access is not, do I have a bike physically? Oftentimes the access is knowing that I can, having a bike lane that makes me feel secure in my Black or brown, historically disadvantaged neighborhood, right? I myself didn't start until I moved into an apartment and looked outside my window and said, oh, I have a bike lane. This was meant for me. I feel like I have an inroad. I feel protected. As bike mayor, I was nominated by the international organization and organizers around the country to be the people's bike mayor. And that's different from, as Anna made reference to, the thought of somebody who's installed into government to be about active transport and coordinate it all. My goal is to help people essentially, well, there's a couple of things, right? For the greater bicycling community, my goal is to help everyone recognize that there should be no elitism, and that no one type of cyclist is greater than the other. It is especially important right now that people embrace this, what I call mutual vulnerability of being a cyclist between a road cyclist who's competitive and wants to go long distances for recreation to working cyclists who are, we're going to see more and more growth amongst, because in these pandemic times, we are literally relying on them as part of our food system, not so much as an option anymore. And they're facing a great amount of still negative interactions with the police. They are not the most highest paid workers, but they have their bikes taken from them constantly, harassment, the violence of just being on the street, and the inadequacy of our lanes that are not all protected but should be. So working cyclists really need to be honored and considered as part of what's going on. I want to see more education being given, because I say, you know, education is a cyclist's first defense against the environment around them so that they can respond to whatever negative action might happen. However, there's no way I can educate, or anyone can educate anyone more greatly to compensate for the failures of infrastructure. And then finally, the project that I launched most recently was called Bigfix Day, and I can drop a link for a video for you all to see it all. But Bigfix Day was about looking at our surroundings and our circumstances right now in COVID, and looking at who really is the most vulnerable. And I want all of New York City, and this is really the meaning of equity, is to look at the total population, our total society, and see where are the weak points, who is being least taken care of, where is injustice the greatest. And naturally, because of the history of our country, it's along racial lines, but those racial lines and transportation are not separate. You know, neighborhoods such as East New York and Brownsville, where I launched Bigfix Day to fix the goal of 100 bikes to enable citizens to have greater access to socially distant, is pivotal. Black and brown people are dying and being infected at the greatest rates across the city and the country. And if we know that they don't have adequate transportation, if we know that there's no bike shops where they are, if we know that they are chronically least financially well off, then we need to solve all those problems together, and it helps us all. So that kind of mindfulness about not only being a bicycle friendly city, but being a neighbor minded city is really what will save us. Thanks.
Thank you, Courtney. And now let's hear from Danny Harris, who's Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. Danny joined Transportation Alternatives as the Executive Director in September 2019. He was former Program Director with the Knight Foundation in San Jose, California, where he supervised grant making for placemaking, transportation, and affordable housing. So Danny, with COVID, we've seen how open streets and pop-up bike lanes have dramatically increased mobility for pedestrians and cyclists. How do we ensure these open space innovations are long-lasting in reclaiming streets for our people?
First of all, thank you, Susan. Thank you to Municipal Art Society, and thank you to my fellow panelists, Anna, Courtney, and Sam. Just as a starting point, Transportation Alternatives has been working in support of better walking, biking, and public transit in New York City for almost 50 years. And the equation that we are trying to solve is a pretty simple one that's infinitely complicated to solve, which is space minus cars equals quality of life. And we know in that equation what is static and what is dynamic, and we have a sense of what those quality of life outcomes mean for all residents across the city. And so when we think about what this moment means, I just want to start with, there's a number of challenging words that people are using now, opportunity being one, but the other one that I want to highlight is this term of going back to normal. And I think that certainly there are some elements that we do want to go back to normal in, especially as it relates to the public health crisis. But I think we need to start with the reality that transportation, especially in New York City, is broken, and it was broken. And what that means in terms of your inability to open your window and not hear honking or car alarms, what it means to live in the Azimuth Triangle in the Bronx, what it means to live in a community of color that had a highway that ran right through it and that continues to be underserved and and that continues to be left behind by street safety improvements. And we can sort of amplify that out across a number of different ways. And I think that really starts with the preeminence of the automobile. And I think we'll talk about a lot of things here, but just one of the things that I would like to share just to, from the advocacy perspective is, when we show up at community meetings and we're working on whether it's a protected busway or bikeway or street improvements, we're not sitting across the table from representatives of General Motors or Ford Motor Company or Dodge. We're obviously responding to what the community is sharing with us. And I think one of the big challenge points, especially in this work, and I want to start with the fact that we're not simply talking about bicycles and buses, we're talking about opportunity here. We're talking about real challenges that are facing communities. Is a lot of the pushback that we're getting, and if you want to look at the multiple lawsuits that are brought against the DOT for these projects, whether it's on the 14th Street busway, where I believe there were 3 lawsuits. Now we have the busway out in Main Street that the city is being sued at again. Is ultimately what we're allowing in many cases is community voices, and again we want to empower voices from across the city. But it's really sort of individuals that have been long addicted to automobiles that are on the front line of pushing back against options. And again, our goal is not to take away cars or to remove assets from neighborhoods. It's quite simply to give people more transportation options across the city. So in a community, if you maybe at best only have a transit, if you live in a transit desert, or maybe you have a car as the only way to get around, then the city has failed you. The car companies have failed you. The oil companies have failed you. A slew of interests have continued to fail you. And yes, I would also add that advocates and groups like ours have failed many communities in the past by not being as representative of New York City. And this is work that we are doing and that we need to continue to do moving forward. But I think this is a critical moment where we need more New Yorkers to start to look at our streets and see the realm of possibilities that they present that are responsive to community needs. Again, let me say that the space needs to be responsive to community needs. And for just a very brief period in New York City, 8.6 million New Yorkers could look outside of their window and for the first time see something different, which is what their city looked like without all of the traffic. And while many New Yorkers may not have had the language that we do here about active transportation and urbanism or bike mayors or, they might simply just respond in things that were relevant to them. I can sleep with my windows open because it's quiet. My older parents can cross the street without fear of being hit. My children can ride their bike around the neighborhood. I can breathe. All of these are sort of very integral pieces that advocates have been fighting for decades, is to quite simply get more New Yorkers to see the possibilities of a city where we sort of move away from this prioritization of car movement and storage and start to prioritize people. And so now we're seeing 10,000 restaurants that are opening up on the street. We're seeing schools, potentially retail and cultural institutions that are starting to spill out in the street. We're seeing more opportunity for active transportation. But what I want to right now, the way that the city has rolled out this plan, and Courtney, Sam, and I all sat on the Mayor's Surface Transportation Task Force, where we advanced a set of ideas to try to get ahead of this wave of Carmageddon, this growing group of death. And unfortunately, the mayor has not even responded to the recommendations that we've shared. And so what it means now is that we're fighting over the crumbs. Instead of right now, interests that are actually taking over and seeing opportunity on this space, it shouldn't be the bike lane versus the restaurants or the schools. It should be, how do we reimagine our streets so that they serve the highest purpose for the most number of New Yorkers? And that means, how do we help nurses who have the longest commute time in New York City? It means, how do we address the challenges in the asthma triangle in the Bronx? It means, how do we connect more New Yorkers, especially the most vulnerable, to not only safe streets where they can cross, but streets where the invitation is genuine. When we say, please go out and enjoy the space, it means that it's genuine for everybody, especially for our most vulnerable communities and communities of color. So we're at a very critical moment in New York where we need to not think specifically about a street. We need to start to think about the vision of how these things start to connect. And I know it's a simple concept of saying we need to build a street for people, but if we do so, it means that we move away from the trench warfare approach of fighting and winning 14th Street busway and now having to go fight out on Main Street in Queens, and then doing the same with every protected bike lane or daylighting project, or you fill in the blank. The projects where we see this working well is where you have a vision, the leadership, and you also are starting to embed these into the less sexy elements of life, whether it's how you change level of service, whether it's how you embed these projects into the Department of Health instead of the Department of Transportation, or if you start to look at this concept of a 15-minute city or a series of other projects that are taking place around the world. And what I want to leave you with here is the fact that while we can certainly take a look at cities all across the world, from Bogota and Lima to obviously what's happening in Northern Europe and Asia, and even in East Africa, what I want to suggest is that New York, we have fought so incredibly hard for milestone wins. You can look at a place like Times Square or 14th Street or the protected bike lanes that are growing across the city, not at a pace that's fast enough, not equitably enough. But the reality is that New York's challenge right now is not about innovation. Our challenge is about scale. We can take a look at some of the most incredible projects that New York City has been leading the nation on. And my question to our leadership is, why do we only have one of them? Why do we have two or three? Why don't we have them all across the city? Why aren't we taking the hard work that we've done and scaling them to the neighborhoods that need them, especially the ones that need them the most? So I'm really excited about this conversation and welcome your ideas as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. That was really a call to action for all of us. So, because you were the last speaker, I'm going to ask you, New York City is unique in many ways, and I guess I would ask all of our speakers to turn on their video and their unmute. You know, New York City is unique in many ways, but is there a model city that we should be turning to as a safer, more efficient, better transportation city?
I would say no. I think when we do that, it creates too many challenges of comparison and, well, we're New York, but we're not someone else. I think, again, we have the tools in place. We certainly have the innovation in the city. You know, we're lucky to have a grid that many other cities don't. And I think that, you know, a lot of what we're pushing for is, again, it's not innovative. You know, these ideas have worked in communities going, you know, looking around the world for decades, if not hundreds of years. I think we need the leadership. We don't simply need to say we need to be Copenhagen. We just need the leadership to build and scale these ideas and fight for them.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of things that Danny said, but I think we can also learn from a lot of other cities. I spent some time, I was working on a book about different cities and transportation, and I spent some time with the equivalent of the Commissioner of Transportation in Barcelona, only they changed the name from Commissioner of Transportation to Commissioner of Mobility. And the way they looked at things was suddenly different. Instead of looking at vehicles, they found that more than half the trips that people made in Barcelona were by walking or biking. So they began to measure things differently. They also began to make a lot of design changes, which I would love to see here that we really haven't done. We haven't done everything that other cities have done. We've done a lot of things, but when I asked how come Barcelona, a city of 1.5 million to 2 million people and a big daytime population, had so few pedestrian fatalities, one is too many, but you can count them on your hands each year. He kind of leaned across the table and said to me, it's because we make the lanes very, very narrow. So there's a lot of design features that we can learn that can increase pedestrian safety. I would love to see us do many of these things in New York. At one time, transportation alternatives, and they probably still were at a campaign, 20 is plenty, meaning 20 miles an hour. And my arguments with the predecessor to Danny were about, you had to design it. Just putting up signs is not enough. And so I'd love to see much slower speeds achieved, not just with enforcement, and in fact, less with enforcement, more with design. And that could help tremendously and curb a good deal of the traffic violence and suddenly see other modes of transportation as being as or more attractive.
So several of you have worked on the Mayor's Advisory Council. There's a question in the chat about what some of the recommendations were. Sam, you mentioned slowing New Yorkers down. What were some of the others?
Well, we were on different subcommittees, although we all would get together, and I think we're mostly in agreement. One was we need to very soon, and if you're looking at the congestion on our roadways, right now our expressways are at more than 100%. And the number of people being killed on our roads is more than 100% of previous years. And if you look at the rate, it's plus 30%. We need to start looking at things that we have done in the past, such as occupancy restrictions, which we imposed in 1980 during the transit strike, post 9/11, post Sandy. One of my pet peeves, and I'll turn it over to Danny and Courtney, who could tell you some others, is to get rid of privileged parking. And those are the placards that people have, legal placards, illegal placards. It's not as hard as people think. When I was traffic commissioner, traffic enforcement came under the traffic commissioner, and we were able to solve a lot of those problems and eliminate a lot of authorized parking. Past decade, it has grown enormously, and that affects our street space. I think earlier, Susan, you may have mentioned the percentage of street space that is taken up. When I look in lower Manhattan, the placards in some cases are taking 1/3 of the available street space. And who's getting hurt? The truckers who double park, pedestrians that don't have enough room, bike riders, buses, and others. But Courtney and Danny can add to that list.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So definitely from the bicycle and public space, we were discussing, well, and this is a proponent that I bring to every panel or organization I'm in, is the need to prioritize growth for outside in. Right? Usually our bike lane networks grow from a central business district, which is then surrounded by affluent and white residents, and then it peters out toward the outer boroughs, the far reaches, the former two fare zones. And so making sure that equity was the leading factor in how we prioritize our distribution of resources, also dedicated space that was just for bicycling and pedestrians, such as bike boulevards. There was, if we look at where we already have like a super great traction, like for example, Broadway from Union Square on up could be a great connector between Times Square and there. And it's so many people are accustomed to that narrow lane that it might as well just be people and just bikes. And with the growth of bikes, this boom, with the growth of delivery cycling, it's absolutely needed that we're going to have dedicated space and where people are already more heightened to be aware for us.
Thanks, Courtney. Anna, there's several questions about cyclists in Amsterdam and, generally obeying the rules and that, how big a detriment politically is that to advance an uptake of cycling in New York?
Well, I'm actually not proud of that the Dutch people obey the rules. They actually behave sort of, some people, not all, but if they are the king on the streets, and it's probably because in most parts it's safe to ride your bike, so you can just, it's not only that, it's also people are using their bike to go from one place to another place as quick as possible. It's just the way to move around. It's the way to get to your work, it's the way to get to your soccer game, to go and do grocery shopping, whatever it takes. It's just you go on your bike and you want to do it as quick as possible. So that's why they are crossing red lights sometimes, or going against traffic, or those kind of things. You see those things. I think it's a bit of how to change this, or how to create a shift, actually. That's a good question, and I don't have the answer for that. But I think in order to get there, we need to do a lot of other things first, because once we are there, then we have probably this bicycle-friendly culture here in the city, and that would be, in my opinion, that would be great. But I think it starts with maybe making sure that you you can, for example, you can find people if they are doing the wrong thing. You can create advertisements around it. You can, it's about behavior. So you can, and I think that's something what is happening here a lot, that people are actually using their voice. They are telling, like, if you're doing something wrong, they will say it in your face. And
like somebody shouted out to me that I should use my hand signals. Yes.
Yeah, for example. Well, and first of all, I think it's important that people learn to use the hand signals. So, and that starts with like having the right lessons. For example, when I went to not high school, but primary school, actually, I was 7 or something. I had to get my bicycle diploma. And it was basically learn. It was a bit boring because I knew how to ride my bike. I was lucky enough to ride my bike, that I knew how to balance it, but I didn't knew the road signs or how to use the road in the best way. So it's normal in the Netherlands that everyone gets their has to get their bicycle diploma to know how to ride your bike. And that's something which we can start here as well. Make sure that you have school programs where you will tell everyone and the kids, especially how to use your bike in the right way, or how to walk in the right way, or other active transportation modes. So that could be a good start.
Yeah.
And Anna, I have a question for Anna.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anna, in New York City, one of the things that I've campaigned against unsuccessfully is that the rules for bike riders are essentially the same rules for drivers, and the penalties are pretty much the same. And Courtney touched upon that, and it results in uneven enforcement, and it results in confrontations and that sort of thing. Is it different in Amsterdam? Is it different in the Netherlands, or are the rules the same, the rules of the road for bike riders and drivers?
No, it's different. You won't get a high fine as you like if you cross red light on your bike. It's different than if you cross red light by car, and that probably has to do with safety. If you cross by car, you can get into a really big crash probably, and if you do it by bike, you can. What they probably will think, you can harm yourself. You can get into a crash yourself, but it's not as bad for the environment around you. So it's different, definitely.
In regards to this whole conversation, I think it's super important to note that when most cyclists, of course, there's the errant cyclist who just wants to be a lawbreaker. But when most cyclists are breaking the law, it's because they're trying to act in interest of their, like, I last night, for example, came down the street and saw traffic approaching me from an intersection that I know that if I let the cross traffic go, I would be in danger, right? So I went to the opposite side of the street and all that kind of stuff, which is not what I should have done. But for my safety, I knew it was the best thing to be done. So it loops back again into having right infrastructure given to us. But something that our audience can and should support going forward is in requesting more education be generally provided by our departments of transportation, because there's oftentimes this belief that it's one thing or the other. They go together. They're complementary. Infrastructure and education promotion by our transportation authorities. We have Bike New York, and Bike New York, works and has with more schools to get 8th graders educated in cycling, and this is the age that kids usually fall off in cycling seriously between toys and transportation. And myself, I even was the default chair for the Department of Transportation when we thought the L train was going to shut down, because it's known that most of our adults they're doing, people equate being able to physically propel a bike with being able to ride a bike, which is not the same as navigate a bike. And it is one of the things that I sorely wish that more investment in time was given to as someone who's a licensed instructor.
So we've spent a lot of time on cycling. Sam, you had talked about in past decades, giving up parking spaces, giving up placards. How do we get people and politicians to understand that some of these sharing the road is actually a better and safer, will provide a better and safer neighborhood, and is also not leading to gentrification?
Okay, well, let me deal with the first part of it is our politicians all have parking placards. So their heart is not in it. I think that we have to do is.
So we should get Mayor de Blasio on a bike.
Right.
Good luck.
Or subway so another part of it is, as long as enforcement remains with the police department, that's not what they're interested in doing. It is, we've seen no success since 1990, about 1996, Giuliani brought it back to the police department. We started doing this type of enforcement back in 1973, when Benjamin Ward, the first Black police commissioner and first Black traffic commissioner, brought traffic enforcement, civilianized traffic enforcement. We need to have a return to the past. DOT could do a much better job of traffic enforcement than the police department. Fewer confrontations. During my tenure, millions, tens of millions of confrontations that we had, and nobody got killed in our confrontations. It can be done, and we eliminated a lot of parking adjacent to schools. It's outrageous. The reason we had parking cleared by schools was for the safety of the school children. So emergency vehicles could pull up, so parents could drop their kids off. What it has become now, teachers parking. And lower Manhattan, Midtown, and almost everywhere, whether legal or illegal placards. I don't get the connection with the gentrification part of your question, Susan.
I can speak to that if you want me to, Susan.
Sure, Courtney.
So, frequently proponents or counter proponents, opponents of bicycling in neighborhoods of color, as they see bicycle lanes as signs that gentrification is coming to their neighborhood to displace them. And it's a yes and a no, right? Because it's not that bike lanes cause the gentrification, they're a symptom of the will to be discriminatory in investment in neighborhoods and real estate. So I give this historical example all the time and I mean, it's your human psychology. If somebody treats you wrong for a very, very, very long time, and then they walk up and be like, hey, I've got some candy for you. You're like, what's in this candy? Like, what's about to happen to me? And just historically, when colonizing people come in, let's just think of Lower Manhattan. All of Lower Manhattan was literally walled off except for little inroads, right? When I needed to go uptown, when I needed to come into people of color's space, I made paths for myself. And since our overall government does not actively and consistently invest in communities of color with transportation and specifically bicycling, the red flag that goes up, the collective consciousness is, this is about to be my displacement. And therefore we get a unfortunate misconception that bike lanes, which exist to protect universal lives, then are perceived as a symptom of disinvestment or displacement.
Right. You've all been a part of a big advocacy movement for different, better city, better types of transportation, better design. What do you think are some of the key ways of having people join the movement? Is it a pop-up? Is it is it a march? Is it a bike march or bicycle parade? I'm just trying to think about how do we get more people on board, that we need to find better better ways for our future city, for our transportation network?
I think there are actually different ways to do that. And the open streets plan, what is happening now and going on in the city, that's actually a great example of what is possible if you close down the streets for cars, for example. But I know that I've joined, that's I think 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, there was this bike train organized for Transportation Alternative on 5th Avenue, and was sort of a pop-up. We blocked a car lane and we were able to bike there. And that was such a fun thing to do, but it was also a great example of like having a look at the street. What is possible if you take up one lane for bikes? What happened actually, the cars were actually using the other lanes and the traffic ran smoothly. So that was actually a perfect example that it's possible if what happens if you just have a little bit less space for cars and more space for something else. And that's the thing, I think in New York, there's just so much space and it just depends on what the layout will be. You can just rethink the layout. And what was a great thing in why actually in Amsterdam, why the culture switched from a car culture to a bike culture, that was, I don't know if you know, the Stop the Kindermoord protest. And that was protests people were laying on the streets because children were being murdered like at the streets because it was not safe enough. So they called it Stop the Kindermoord. It's like Stop the Children's Murder. And they were really protesting for that and advocating for it. So I always think advocating is a great thing. Look at what people, how they want to join. So it's different kind of things. It's pop-ups, it's advertising for it. It's all different modes.
Right. I guess, Annie and Sam, are there other micro-mobility modes that we need to be advocating for?
So I want to, if I can go back to the other question, if that's all right, Susan.
Sorry.
I think as a starting point, if you're not enraged by this, you should be. And you know, people ask me, you know, why are cyclists angry, or why are some cyclists angry? And I think a starting point is because you're given an inequitable, disingenuous invitation to be out in the city. I mean, if you think about our bike infrastructure, it's as if the city has built half a bridge between two boroughs and then just said, okay, well, we haven't put you can get to the end of the bridge and you have to jump off and swim, and we hope you'll get across the other side. So we don't take this seriously. And that means that as more people are cycling, and I hearken back to, you know, the mayor in March had suggested that New Yorkers should walk or bike if you can, and then did little to nothing to actually protect this huge bike boom of people who jumped into it. So I would sort of encourage you that, one, you just sort of have more awareness. So think of if you actually are able to get around safely, you know, whether it's to cross the street, and especially think of the most vulnerable users in your life or those who you may know, or think of your neighbors. But also, you know, I have 2 little kids and they're learning to ride a bike now. And as Courtney, you know, had said, these will be toys for them. My kids will learn how to ride a bike and they'll be stuck in a playground until either, you know, they can continue to ride with me, or that New York City will make some transformation, God willing, in my lifetime. So I think as a starting point, it's looking at what's happening in your neighborhood, you know, understanding how to hold our electeds accountable. You know, we have things that we've won even in the last year: Vision Zero, the Green Wave Plan, the Streets Master Plan, the Dangerous Vehicle Abatement Program. These were promises that the city had made that they have not yet delivered. And they are saying that they're because of budget cuts. But you can look back over history at quite simply, what does the city promise, whether it's in your neighborhood in the city, and what have they not delivered, and what are the reasons for that? And I think you have, you know, no shortage of organizations that are willing to help to support you to be on the front lines of advocacy or to learn about it. So, you know, I would encourage you to come and join the fight, and just start by listening and learning. And there are no shortage of organizations like ours that are happy to help support.
You know, and the focus of Danny and Anna on children is a very effective way of communicating. Kindermoord, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Anna, but In the 1920s, monuments were erected to all the children that were killed in Baltimore and Cleveland, in Cincinnati and St. Louis, in New York, in Washington, D.C. There's a very good book about it called Fighting Traffic by Peter Norton. I urge everybody to read about the first 30 years of last century because it's a warning of what we could face going forward. And unfortunately, great, thanks, Danny. Unfortunately, we failed. Even with all those monuments, when we talk about micromobility, you keep hearing how dangerous it is to ride scooters or bikes or other forms of micromobility. What it is the streets are so dangerous because of the cars going so fast and recklessly on them. So we really need to tame the traffic. But I also want to say in micromobility, we have to think about it not as a panacea, not necessarily as the answer. We have to ask a few questions. Is it better than shoes? What I mean by that, if you can walk 5 blocks, that's much better than riding a scooter on a sidewalk and going 5 blocks or 10 blocks. So the shoes test, it's kind of like a Rube Goldberg solution for going just a few blocks. We have these crazy inventions, hovercrafts and others. We have too many of them, and we can't share the sidewalks with all these vehicles out there. The second part of the test is the transit test. Are we taking people out of transit? Are we taking people out of cars? If we're taking people out of transit, we really have to evaluate that. Is that sensible? Are we hurting ourselves? Are we then once again starting that downward spiral with transit that we saw in the late 1940s, 1950s? Fewer people riding transit, less revenue for transit, less of a voice for a transit, cut back service, and then less transit. And we now know the crisis that transit is in. So before we go wild with micromobility, let's look at the shoes test and the transit test going forward.
And I do think
it might not be half as much fun as riding a scooter.
Susan, may I chime in?
Sure.
I do think, yeah, those little hovercrafts are crazy. I do think when it comes to answering the question of like convincing people to want to shift, we really have to, and this is just my approach, is like really looking at people's the psychology. Like all humans, we share the same kind of psychology and just a different society. And I think it's fundamental that we help each other get rid of, or at least when it comes to bikes and little mobility alternatives, get rid of this aggressive hate for each other. Like bikes must hate cars and cars must hate bikes. If we just need to invent some kind of mutual enemy, which is actually the role that like putting the preservation of our children's lives, right? We need to help each other. I think we have a lack of seeing the function of all of these different mobility options, right? When cars look at bikes, they don't see someone helping keep air pollution out of the way. They don't see less space being taken up. They aren't thinking in a functional way about how does this actually benefit me? And everything has its pros and cons. I think we as advocates would benefit to help all of the users see the pros and advantages, the pros and cons of everything else, because it will steer us toward making some kind of more united front and finding our actual enemy in the situation, which is ultimately loss of life, injury, and death.
Yeah. Do I have a second to build on to?
1 second, Danny, and then we need to be wrapping up.
Okay. So I agree with everything Courtney said. And I think the other piece that I would just add on to it is I don't want to put the autos aside, because I think, if you look at the current US auto fleet, 3/4 of all the vehicles that are being produced are SUVs and light trucks, and those numbers are only growing. And so, a Hummer, whether it's run by compost or electric, still is targeting our most vulnerable users. So we know that the production of vehicles now is targeting especially pedestrians and cyclists, and we need to hold the automobile manufacturers accountable, especially for the danger that they're posing to vulnerable street users.
So it almost feel like we should all band together, and that's what I think MAS is trying to get us to do, to join our voices. So we've covered a lot of ground, especially on cycling. and in this session. So in a lightning round, I give you one last word that you'd all like to leave with us. So Sam, you started us off. How about if you start us off here to end this session?
This is the best walking city in the country. Get out there and walk and enjoy it.
Anna.
I agree on that. It's fun to be here outside. Just if you go out tomorrow, just look around what you see. Just look around what happens in the space, with the space, how many cars there are parked, how you can use the space differently. Just think about that.
Courtney.
City will never truly be just and brag worthy if we're not thinking of every single citizen in it and how they're experiencing mobility and transportation.
And Danny.
New York City doesn't need another op-ed or a group of panelists talking. They need people who are on the front lines fighting, especially in the communities that need it most. So get off your computer and come join the fight.
Thank you all. And thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you to the MAS team for this incredible series. Now I invite Elizabeth back to close our program. Elizabeth, where are you? Or should I close the program?
There we go. Sorry about that. Just a little technical difficulty. Thank you all. This was a fantastic discussion. Clearly, we could have gone on for many more hours tonight with all of your insights and observations. And to Danny's point, maybe we should just move on and get out there and start advocating for better transit throughout the city. I think that is a good clarion call for all of us. And I will always remember Courtney's brag-worthy city. To go fight for a brag-worthy city, which has to be, of course, an equitable and fair city at its very root. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to our audience. And thank you to Susan, as always, for your extraordinary moderating. We appreciate all of the speakers' insights, and Susan, your incredible ability to shape the conversation, and for having helped us shape this series. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues at MAS for their incredible work pulling the series together and managing the logistics throughout. They make it possible for all of us. I hope that if you're not already a member of MAS, you'll consider joining. Your membership dollars and donations help us continue providing programming like this, and also, to Danny's point, supporting our advocacy and policy work. We hope that you'll stay tuned for upcoming MAS programs and tours by visiting mas.org/events. And if you'd like to learn more about the history of bicycling in New York City, join us on Saturday, November 21st at 11 a.m. for a virtual tour called The Bedford Rest, Brooklyn's bicycle craze of the 1890s, with guides Susan Spellin and Morgan Muncie. Please have a wonderful evening and a great holiday season as it approaches us quickly, and we certainly hope to see you all next time. Thank you again.